The turbines roared like the heart of destiny about to change. Inside that crowded plane, among hurried executives, excited tourists and sleepy families, a man occupied seat 23A, Gabriel Nogueira. Disheveled blonde hair, green eyes that carried the weight of a past few could imagine. At first glance, he seemed just another tired passenger, perhaps a man aimlessly returning home. But no one there knew that he had already truly touched the sky, and that on that day God would make him touch it again. That morning, Gabriel almost gave up on boarding. His hands trembled when he received the ticket, an unexpected gift from a woman at a restaurant where he used to eat with the little he earned selling cans. "Come home, son. God still has a plan for you," she had said. And he believed her. It was the last prayer of a man who hadn't yet lost his faith, even after losing everything. As the plane cut through the clouds, Gabriel closed his eyes and remembered the previous night. Kneeling on the cold sidewalk, he asked God for a sign, a simple sign that his life still had purpose. Little did he know that his request would be answered so literally, so divinely, that the whole of heaven would witness it. The flight was going smoothly until the impossible happened. Before we delve into this amazing story, tell me which city and state you're watching from. Leave a comment and I'll reply with gratitude. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like this video. We want to share more stories like this. The past and the farewell. A light rain fell on the cold sidewalks of a big city that no longer had room for dreams. Gabriel Nogueira walked slowly, his bare feet almost sinking into the puddles that reflected the lights of the buildings. His tired body betrayed sleepless nights, and his worn clothes were the portrait of a man the world had forgotten. Even so, there was something in his eyes, that deep green that defied the grey of the asphalt, that left no doubt. Within him, faith still existed. Faith in God, faith in life, faith that somehow it all still made sense. Gabriel had already known days of glory. Years ago, he was a promising young man, a graduate in civil aviation, a dreamer, disciplined, with his eyes set on the sky. He was the kind of man who believed that the impossible could be achieved with effort. He spent nights studying meteorology, flight calculations, and simulations on old computers. When he received his diploma, his parents, who already lived in the countryside, cried with pride. He was the first in the family to reach such heights, literally. But life sometimes has harsh ways of testing those who dare to dream. No airline hired him. The requirements were high, the licensing costs even higher, and opportunities seemed reserved for those with connections. Gabriel struggled, tried, sent out resumes, slept in cheap boarding houses near airports, believing that one day someone would see his worth. But time passed, and the doors remained closed. When the money ran out, he tried new jobs, salesman, waiter, delivery driver, until he lost his apartment and found himself with a backpack on his back and his hope hanging by a thread. Even so, he never lost faith. On the streets, he was known by everyone who passed by the small corner diner. "Here comes Gabriel with the cans," the waiters would say, some with pity, others with respect. He collected cans, sold them at the junkyard, and with the little he earned, he ate a simple meal every day. It was there that he met Donna Helena, a kind-hearted lady who had worked at the restaurant for over 20 years. She observed him quietly, always polite, thanking everyone after each meal, and one day decided to strike up a conversation. "You have the eyes of someone who has flown high, my son," she said, while serving a plate of rice and beans. Gabriel smiled awkwardly and replied, "Yes, I have flown, but it seems like the fuel has run out." She smiled back, without imagining the weight behind those words. Over time, the two developed a beautiful friendship. Helena listened to him talk about his flying lessons, about how much he loved the sound of the turbines and the feeling of looking at the world from up there. It was the only time he spoke with a sparkle in his eyes. That night, however, something different hung in the air. The wind blew cold, the sky threatened a storm, and Gabriel's gaze seemed more distant. He was tired of promises that were never kept, of looks of contempt, of days when his stomach ached more than his heart. Sitting on the sidewalk, with his hands clasped, he looked at the sky and murmured a prayer. Lord, if there is still a purpose for me, show me a sign. I don't want to wander aimlessly anymore. Just give me a chance to believe again. The words were carried away by the wind, but in Gabriel's heart they echoed like a cry from the soul. The next morning he returned to the restaurant. He was soaked from the rain, but with a shy smile. Donna Helena, seeing him, ran inside and returned with a small envelope. Here, Gabriel, I'm not rich, but I want to help you. It's a ticket back to your hometown. Someone is waiting for you there. He was speechless. He opened the envelope and saw the plane ticket. He cried. He couldn't believe it. She held his hand and said, "You always believed in God. Know that He doesn't forget those who have faith. Perhaps this trip is the sign you asked for." With tears streaming down his face, Gabriel vowed that one day he would repay that gesture. He left with the ticket in his pocket and a rekindled hope. He spent the rest of the day organizing the little he had, a clean shirt, an old notebook with flight notes, and a faded photo of his parents. That night, he found shelter in a cheap guest house, sharing a room with other travelers. He lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. "Thank you, God," he whispered before falling asleep. At dawn the next day, the city awoke to a frenetic pace. Cars honking, subways packed, people rushing to work. Gabriel walked against the flow, clutching his backpack tightly. Each step was a mixture of fear and gratitude. He arrived at the airport hours early and sat in the lobby, watching the planes take off. It was a familiar, nostalgic sound. The smell of kerosene, the roar of the turbines, the coming and going of uniforms and suitcases, everything reminded him of who he had been and who he still dreamed of being. When his flight was called, he stood up slowly, taking a deep breath. He boarded the aircraft and found his seat. The people around him glanced discreetly. He didn't care. He knew his appearance didn't match the elegant setting, but what mattered was what was inside him. And inside him was faith. He made the sign of the cross, closed his eyes, and gave thanks for the opportunity to return home. During takeoff, he looked out the window and saw the city shrinking. From up there, everything seemed different. The pain, the fear, the humiliations, it all seemed part of a bigger plan. God, guide me. If this is my last trip, let it be with a peaceful heart, he thought. But deep down, something inside him whispered that this flight wouldn't just be a return home, it would be a new beginning. As the plane gained altitude, Gabriel opened his small notebook and leafed through the pages filled with technical notes. There were records of maneuvers, coordinates, and altitude calculations he had noted during the course. They were memories of a time when the sky was the limit, not a distant dream. He smiled. He remembered his instructor saying, "A good pilot is not one who never faces storms, but one who learns to trust the instruments when the sky darkens." And at that moment, that phrase made sense in a new way. In the back of the plane, a child began to cry, frightened by the light turbulence that was shaking the flight. Gabriel looked at her and smiled gently. "Everything will be all right," he said softly. It was almost as if he was saying it to himself. The plane was heading towards its destination, but Gabriel didn't know that his true destination was about to find him. As the sun rose outside and the golden clouds parted like celestial veils, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Within him, a soft voice echoed, "You asked for a sign, Gabriel. It is coming." And at that moment, the story began to change, not just his, but the stories of everyone on that flight. The turbulence and the call of heaven. The plane cut through the clouds like a silent arrow, floating above the intense blue sky. Inside, the soft sound of the engines and the murmur of the passengers created a false sense of security. Gabriel watched the horizon through the window, where the sun rose in orange hues, and felt something inside him warming, a peace he hadn't known in a long time. It was as if God were cradling him, silently saying, "Trust, son, everything has its time." Around him, life went on as normal. A smiling flight attendant served coffee, a child played with the back of the seat, a couple whispered about their destination. But behind this tranquility, fate was already preparing its own twist. Suddenly, a different vibration ran through the fuselage. Gabriel looked up, feeling the plane tremble slightly. The sound of the engines changed tone, almost imperceptible to most, but not to him, who had spent years studying that kind of noise. It was as if the plane had lost its rhythm for a moment. He looked around. Some people continued reading, others dozing, unaware, but he felt it. Something was wrong. The pilot's instinct, dormant for years, awoke within him with the force of a lightning bolt. Minutes later, the shaking intensified. The plane lurched sharply, and glasses began to fall. The sound of vibrating metal echoed through the compartments, and a nervous voice came over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing light turbulence." The voice belonged to a flight attendant, but the tone betrayed something more serious. Gabriel fastened his seatbelt, but his heart was racing. Light turbulence, he thought. Doesn't sound like light. The interior lights flickered once, then twice. The plane shook violently, and the passengers began to scream. A suitcase fell from the overhead compartment, hitting a man in the shoulder. The child's cry echoed loudly, mingling with the sound of the wind and the turbines straining. Gabriel gripped the seat in front of him, trying to remain calm. "Sir, show me what's happening," he murmured. Then the cockpit door suddenly opened. A flight attendant rushed out, her face pale, her hands trembling. "We need help. The captain has fainted," she screamed. Silence fell instantly. The screams ceased, replaced by a mute terror that swept through every row. The woman continued, her voice choked with emotion. "We don't have a co-pilot on this flight. He was replaced at the last minute, and the captain is unconscious. There's no one to fly." Chaos filled the cabin. Shouts, prayers, tears. A woman began to recite the Lord's Prayer aloud. Others tried to connect their cell phones without signal. Gabriel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Within him, an ancient force rose. It was as if time had stopped, and the call he had made the night before now echoed powerfully. "You asked for a sign, Gabriel. It's now." Without thinking, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Eyes followed him. A man in simple clothes, unshaven, looking like someone forgotten by fate. But there was firmness in his expression. "Sir, where are you going?" the flight attendant asked. "To help. I'm a pilot," he replied calmly, and his words cut through the panic like a blade. She looked at him in disbelief, but desperation left her no choice. She led him to the cockpit, where the captain lay unconscious, his head slumped over the controls. Red lights flashed on the panel, alarms blared, and the radio transmitted only static. Gabriel looked at the instruments, and in seconds, something he thought he had forgotten was completely rekindled. The training, the lessons, the instinct, it all returned. It was as if every cell in his body remembered who he truly was. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, adjusted his headset and assessed the data. The plane was on an unscheduled descent with an automatic control failure. The flight attendant's trembling voice sounded behind him. "Do you really know what you're doing?" He didn't answer. He only said, "I know enough to try to save everyone here." He picked up the internal microphone and spoke in a firm voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gabriel Nogueira. I am a qualified pilot, and I am taking control of the aircraft. I need everyone to remain calm and follow the crew's instructions." For a few seconds, silence reigned. Then a wave of hope began to spread among the passengers. Tears gave way to prayers. Gabriel took a deep breath and adjusted the control stick. His hands trembled, but his heart was serene. "Lord, don't let me fail now. If this is the sign I asked for, then give me the strength to honor it." The alarms continued to scream, but he was already connected to something greater. With each maneuver, he felt he wasn't alone. It was as if God himself were guiding his hands. The turbulence intensified. The plane descended abruptly, causing the passengers to float momentarily in the air before falling back into their seats. Shouts echoed, suitcases flew, and the sound of the wind hitting the wings resembled the roar of thunder. Gabriel kept his gaze fixed on the instruments. Altitude, 4,000 feet, and descending fast. "No, no, no, hold on with me, girl," he murmured, as if talking to the plane. The flight attendants strapped themselves into their seats, weeping silently. A passenger in the back began to sing a hymn of faith, and soon others joined in. The sound of dozens of voices singing Amazing Grace filled the cabin, creating an atmosphere that no film could ever reproduce. Tears streamed down Gabriel's face, but his eyes remained steady. "He is here with me," he whispered. The radio crackled and a distant voice replied, "Flight 421, we are receiving your unstable signal. Identify yourself." Gabriel gripped the microphone tightly. "This is Gabriel Nogueira, substituting for the captain. The pilot is unconscious. We are experiencing severe turbulence and automatic system failures. I need immediate authorization for an emergency landing." On the other end, air traffic control responded. "Understood, Gabriel. Can you fly?" He took a deep breath and replied, "With God by my side, I can." The control center began to guide him. The instructions came quickly, but Gabriel's concentration was absolute. Each command, each adjustment was made with surgical precision. Gradually, the plane stabilized, the alarms diminished, the turbulence began to subside. A collective sigh ran through the plane. Hope was reborn, but the challenge wasn't over yet. Fuel was low, and the nearest runway was almost 40 minutes flight away. He knew it would be an eternity if something went wrong. "We'll make it," he said softly. He remembered the prayer from the previous night, the cold pavement, the plea for a sign. Now he understood everything. This moment wasn't a coincidence, it was purpose. As he piloted the plane, Gabriel looked up at the sky, which opened up in a beam of light between the clouds. That ray of sunshine pierced the cabin and illuminated his face like a silent confirmation that he was on the right track. Tears streamed down his face, but his gaze was firm, determined, full of faith. The passengers, now silent, watched the windows. Outside, the sky that had once seemed menacing turned golden. Many knelt in the aisles, thanking God. Others looked at the ceiling, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." Aboard that flight, fear transformed into prayer and prayer into miracle. When air traffic control announced that a runway had been cleared, Gabriel took a deep breath. "Let's go home," he said. He adjusted the flaps, reduced speed, and began the descent. The landscape emerged from between the clouds, and the runway appeared in the distance like a hug from the ground. The moment the wheels touched the tarmac, an absolute silence fell over the aircraft. Then applause, loud, emotional, endless. Shouts of joy, cries of relief. Gabriel released the control stick, looked at the sky, and whispered, "The signal has arrived, Dad, and I understand." While the plane was surrounded by police cars and ambulances, he remained there, quiet, his hands still on the controls. Outside, the world was already beginning to call him a hero. But inside, Gabriel knew that it wasn't he who had saved those lives. It was God who had chosen that moment to prove that his plans never fail, even when they seem delayed. The invisible homeless man had become the man who did the impossible, and heaven, once again, had bowed to the faith of a simple dreamer. Recognition and the public miracle. The sun was already rising when the plane's wheels came to a complete stop on the tarmac. The sirens of the fire trucks echoed in the distance. The sound of ambulances approached, and the passengers, still in shock, began to rise with tears, applause, and hugs. Many knelt in the aisle, thanking God. Others tried between sobs to understand what had happened. A simple man in worn clothes, whom no one had noticed when boarding, had saved their lives. The name Gabriel Nogueira began to spread among the whispers, carried by trembling voices of gratitude. And in the midst of all that confusion, he remained seated in the cockpit, his hands still resting on the controls, his eyes brimming with tears, as if still processing the miracle that had just occurred. A flight attendant approached, the same one who had screamed in despair earlier. She looked at him with a mixture of astonishment and reverence. You actually piloted this plane?" she asked, almost unable to believe her own words. Gabriel took a deep breath and replied, "I didn't fly alone. God was with me." And in that simple sentence, spoken in a serene voice, the entire crew felt that this was not just a landing, it was a living testament to faith and purpose. Outside, the emergency crew opened the main door. Fresh air flooded the cabin, mingling with the smell of fuel and a feeling of rebirth. One by one, the passengers began to disembark, many stopping to thank Gabriel. An elderly woman held his hand tightly and wept. "My son, I prayed so much. God put you here for a reason." A father hugged him, saying, "You saved my children. May God bless you forever." Gabriel listened to everything in silence, his heart beating slowly, as if he were still flying inside. As the news began to roll in, cameras positioned themselves on the runway. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pointed, lights flashing. Who is the man who saved Flight 421? How did a former homeless man manage to land a commercial airplane? Was it a miracle or a coincidence? The headlines began to take shape even before the interview began. Gabriel, embarrassed, tried to move away from the cameras, but there was no escaping destiny. An airline officer approached, still breathless, with an astonished expression. "Mr. Nogueira, you were incredible. You saved over 200 lives." The air traffic controllers said the landing was perfect. Gabriel shook his head and replied, "I only did what I had to do. Thank God, not me." The man tried to insist, but he was already walking away, strolling slowly along the runway, his face illuminated by the rising sun. The following hours were a whirlwind. News spread around the world. Hero in the skies. Unemployed ex-pilot saves plane and becomes a symbol of faith. Within minutes, social media exploded with videos of emotional passengers. He was humble. He seemed like an ordinary man. But when the pilot became ill, he was the one who got up. "It was a miracle," said a woman crying in front of the cameras. Images of the plane landing began to circulate, and soon the name Gabriel Nogueira was making international headlines. But while the world called him a hero, he was just looking for a quiet corner in the airport. He sat on a bench near the large windows, looking at the now clear sky, and took a deep breath. "Thank you, Lord. The signal really came," he murmured. In his mind, the faces of the passengers flashed by, the gleam in the eyes of the child who stopped crying, the embrace of the elderly lady. It was all bigger than him. It was the answer to the prayer of a man who never gave up believing. A short time later, a woman approached. She was a reporter, but her expression was different, calm, respectful, almost emotional. "Mr. Nogueira, I know you don't like cameras, but the world needs to hear your story. People need to know that faith still exists, that miracles still happen." Gabriel looked her in the eyes and replied, "The miracle isn't the plane landing. The miracle is the human heart still being able to believe when everything seems lost." The reporter smiled with tears in her eyes and for the first time turned off the recorder before the end of the interview. That same afternoon, the news spread across international news channels. Images of Gabriel at the airport, in his makeshift uniform and with calloused hands, moved the world. Churches, schools, and even airlines cited his name as an example of courage and faith. An executive from a major airline sent an official statement saying, "A man who maintains calm and faith in the face of the impossible is the kind of pilot any company would want." But the most emotional moment was yet to come. Among the hundreds of messages Gabriel began to receive, one of them truly made him cry. It was from Donna Helena, the woman who had given him the ticket. The message read, "I saw you on TV, my son. I knew God still had a plan for you. Heaven was your place, and he was just waiting for the right moment to make you fly again." Gabriel held the phone tightly, tears streaming down his face uncontrollably. "Thank you, my friend. You were the instrument of the miracle," he whispered. The following morning, the airport was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, and even airline representatives were waiting for him. When Gabriel appeared wearing new clothes someone had given him, the crowd began to applaud. He was speechless. He walked slowly, without pride, without vanity, only gratitude. A reporter shouted, "Gabriel, what do you intend to do now?" He stopped, took a deep breath and replied, "I will follow the same flight plan that God has laid out for me." A few weeks later, Gabriel received an official offer. An international airline offered him a job as an assistant pilot, and more than that, complete retraining. The world, which had previously forgotten him, now welcomed him with open arms. During the press conference, a journalist asked, "Mr. Nogueira, how does it feel to be called a hero?" He smiled humbly and replied, "I am not a hero. I am just a man who trusted when everything seemed to be falling apart. And I learned that when life gets out of control, God always takes the controls." The answer went viral and became one of the most shared phrases on social media. When life gets out of control, God takes the controls. That became a symbol of hope. People in hospitals, prisons, shelters, and churches repeated his words. Gabriel didn't just save a plane, he restored faith to thousands of hearts. A month later, he returned to Donna Helena's restaurant, the same place where it all began. Upon entering, she recognized him and dropped her tray, running to embrace him. The encounter was filled with tears and laughter. "I told you, my son, God would still place you on high." He laughed and replied, "And he did, Donna Helena, but in the most unexpected way possible." They sat together, and Gabriel recounted every detail, the turbulence, the panic, the light that pierced the clouds. Helena listened, moved, her eyes brimming with tears. When he left, the sky was clear again. He looked up, saw a plane passing by, and smiled. "Now I understand, Lord. The sign I asked for wasn't to lift me off the ground. It was to teach me to fly with purpose. And so, the man who was once invisible became a light." His story crossed borders, inspired songs, lectures, and films. But for him, the greatest reward was simple: to sleep peacefully again, knowing he was never alone. Gabriel Nogueira, the man who trusted in God in the heavens, proved that even those whom the world tries to bring down can be lifted up by the hands of heaven. Because sometimes God allows us to lose control just to show us that he was always the one in control. Legacy and eternity. The months that followed the miracle in the skies completely changed the course of Gabriel Nogueira's life. The man who once slept on cold sidewalks now woke up in hotel rooms with the window open to the sunrise, ready to speak about faith, courage, and purpose. The world called him the hero of the skies, but he never accepted that title without first correcting it. The true hero is God, who let me fall only to teach me to fly again. The phrase became the symbol of his new mission, to inspire people to believe that no fall is permanent when the heart continues to trust. Gabriel now officially worked as a pilot for a major international airline, but he wasn't just another one among many. His story had touched hearts on every continent. On every flight he made, there was always someone who recognized him and asked to take a picture or just shake his hand. There was something different about the way he conducted each takeoff. Before each departure, he closed his eyes, said a brief prayer, and whispered, "Lord, I place this flight in your hands. May every soul on board arrive safely at their destination." His cabin crew colleagues, even the most skeptical, respected that gesture. Some, inspired by him, also began to pray before each takeoff. On a clear morning, Gabriel was invited to a grand event in New York. He was to be honored by an international aviation organization for his bravery and testimony of faith. The auditorium was packed, more than 1,000 people, including pilots, engineers, journalists, and representatives from airlines around the world. When he took the stage, in a blue suit and with a serene look, the audience rose to their feet in prolonged applause. It was the consecration of a man who had defied statistics and expectations. But he, humble, took a deep breath, smiled, and began his speech with disarming simplicity. "I didn't come here to tell a story of heroism. I came to remind you that God still writes stories of hope." Silence filled the room. Gabriel spoke for long minutes, his voice firm and his emotion restrained. He talked about his days on the streets, about the cans he sold, about Donna Helena, and the event that changed everything. He said that the greatest lesson of his life didn't come from flight manuals, but from the nights when all he could do was pray. "Sometimes heaven seems far away," he said, "but it's in the falls that we learn to see God more closely. When life takes you out of control, it's not the end. It's the beginning of a landing guided by invisible hands." People listened in absolute silence, many discreetly wiping away tears. At the end of the lecture, the audience rose again in applause. But Gabriel did not bow in thanks. He raised his hands, pointing upwards, in a silent gesture of gratitude. The cameras captured that moment, and the image went around the world. A man of faith, humble, recognizing that the miracle was not about him, but about the constant presence of God in the most unlikely places. A few months later, Gabriel returned to Brazil to visit Donna Helena. This time he arrived piloting his own flight. When the plane landed and he descended the stairs, the wind whipped against his face. He took a deep breath of the air of his homeland, his heart filled with memories. He took a simple taxi and went straight to the restaurant. Helena was waiting for him as always, serving customers with that welcoming smile. When she saw him enter, she dropped the plate she was holding and ran towards him. "My son!" she cried. Their embrace was long, full of tears, like a reunion between mother and son. They sat at their usual table, and Gabriel ordered the same plate of rice and beans. "You're still the same, Gabriel," she said, smiling. He laughed. "I just changed altitude, Donna Helena." She chuckled, moved. "I told you God would still put you up there," he replied. "And he did, but only after I learned to look up, even when the ground seemed to crumble." They spent hours talking, and at the end of the day, before saying goodbye, Gabriel handed her an envelope. "It's a gift for you. I want you to never have to work again." Inside, there was a letter and a check with enough money to guarantee her retirement. Helena cried without saying a word. She just hugged him, whispering, "You are living proof that God is never late." As the years passed, Gabriel continued flying. But now each flight was more than just a journey. It was a testimony. In every city, he was invited to speak at schools, churches, and universities. He told his story not as someone who boasts, but as someone who remembers where he came from. He always said, "I was the man who fell to discover that God is the only one who never collapses." People applauded him, but he only smiled and repeated, "All glory belongs to him." One day, during an interview on an international program, they asked, "Gabriel, how do you feel when you look at the sky now, knowing that it almost took everything from you and then gave you back your life?" He calmly replied, "The sky never wanted to take anything from me. I just had to fall to understand that the sky was always supporting me." That answer became one of the most memorable phrases of his career. Years later, when he was about to retire, Gabriel received a surprise tribute. The airline where he worked named one of its planes after him. Faith Wings, next to the booth, they engraved one of his phrases, "When life gets out of control, God takes the helm." Gabriel, visibly moved, touched the letters engraved on the fuselage and smiled. "May each flight carry a little of this faith to the world," he said, before boarding for his last flight as captain. On that final flight, the sunset painted the horizon in golden and pink hues. Gabriel watched the clouds below, like old friends who had accompanied him from the beginning. The co-pilot, a young recent graduate, looked at him and asked, "Commander, what's the secret to flying so well?" Gabriel smiled and replied, "The secret is simple. Never forget who holds up the sky." The young man laughed, thinking it was a metaphor, but in Gabriel's gaze there was something more, a certainty that came from the soul. Upon landing, the entire airport awaited him. Employees, family, friends, passengers he had once saved, all applauding. When he stepped out of the cockpit, he was greeted with a commemorative plaque and the sound of a band playing soft music. He thanked them with a wave and once again pointed upwards. That night, sitting at home, Gabriel opened the same old notebook he had kept since those difficult times. On the yellowed pages, his flight notes, scribbled by hand, were still visible. Among the calculations and diagrams, he wrote one last sentence: "The sky is not the limit, it's a reminder that God is in control." He closed his notebook, looked out the window, and saw a star shining brighter than the others. He smiled. "Mission accomplished, Father." And so, the man who one day asked for a sign found in destiny itself proof that faith never fails. His name was etched not only in the headlines, but in the hearts of all who heard his story. Because Gabriel Nogueira didn't just save a plane, he taught the whole world to fly with faith. Legacy and eternity time passed like a gentle breeze among the clouds, and the whole world learned the name of Gabriel Nogueira Gabriel, the man who had defied death and restored hope to heaven. His story traveled the globe, crossed borders, and touched the hearts of people of all languages. From former homeless man to international hero, Gabriel had become a living symbol that God doesn't need a perfect setting to perform a miracle. All it takes is a heart willing to believe. And that is exactly what he had become. A silent messenger of faith, humility, and purpose. In the first few months after the event, Gabriel's routine changed completely. He received invitations for interviews, lectures, and tributes. But he, with the same simplicity of someone who still remembered the cold sidewalk and the smell of rain, accepted each appearance with only one purpose: to talk about the power of faith. "I didn't fly that plane alone," he would say on every stage. "It was God who held the controls while I trembled." These words echoed in packed auditoriums, bringing tears to even the most skeptical. And that is how Gabriel, a man the world had forgotten, came to be listened to with respect and admiration. Soon after, he was invited by a major international airline to fly again, this time as a co-pilot. When he received the invitation, he held the letter with trembling hands, feeling tears fall onto the paper. It was a new beginning, the definitive sign that God's plans truly come to pass, even when they seem dormant. "Lord, may every flight be yours, not mine," he prayed before accepting. And so began a new phase. Gabriel now crisscrossed the skies of the world, but every time he put on his uniform, he made a point of remembering where he came from. The watch on his wrist was the same one from the difficult times, scratched, old, bought at a thrift store for a few coins. He kept it not out of vanity, but as a living reminder that God's timing is perfect. Before each flight, he silently prayed, "May every soul here return to the ground with a light heart." Many colleagues curiously observed this ritual and over time began to imitate it. It was as if Gabriel's faith had become contagious. Months later, he was invited to an international ceremony in New York, where he would be honored as an example of courage and humanity. The auditorium was immense, filled with important figures: executives, engineers, veteran pilots, and journalists from around the world. When Gabriel took the stage, wearing a dark blue suit and a small brooch with golden wings, the audience rose to their feet in applause. But he, humbly, smiled shyly and made a prayerful gesture with his hands before beginning to speak. "I am not a hero," he began, his voice firm and measured. "I am just a man who, in the midst of chaos, remembered where true strength comes from. Sometimes life takes away our control to teach us who is really at the helm." Silence filled the auditorium. People listened as if hearing a revelation. He continued, "When I asked God for a sign, I never imagined he would put me before such a great test. But I learned that the greatest miracles happen when we surrender ourselves completely." His words were followed by discreet tears, smiles, and renewed applause, not just of admiration, but of transformation. That night, after the event, Gabriel was interviewed by a reporter who asked him, "Mr. Nogueira, how would you define what happened on that flight?" He replied without hesitation, "It was the answer to a prayer, and also proof that God doesn't choose the capable, he empowers the chosen." That phrase went around the world, appearing on magazine covers and social media posts. But for Gabriel, the real reward was far from the spotlight. It was knowing that his story was rekindling faith in people who had already given up. A few weeks later, Gabriel returned to Brazil. He stepped off the plane with a serene smile and a heart heavy with emotion. He took a simple taxi and asked to go straight to Dona Helena's restaurant. When he entered, the familiar smell of home-cooked food enveloped him like a hug. Helena was behind the counter serving customers. When she saw him, she dropped her plate and ran towards him. "My son, I knew God was going to put you on a pedestal," she cried, overcome with emotion. The hug was long, intense, full of tears and laughter. "You were my angel, Dona Helena. The ticket you gave me didn't take me home. It took me to the destiny God wrote." They sat down at the table, and Gabriel ordered his usual dish: rice, beans, and a piece of meat. "Still the same?" she asked, smiling. He replied, "The same heart, only the address of the dream has changed." They talked for hours. Gabriel recounted every detail: the turbulence, the chaos, the moment he felt the sunlight stream through the cabin. Dona Helena wept silently, touching his hand as if touching a living miracle. When they said goodbye, he handed her an envelope. "It's not payment, it's gratitude, so you never have to work again." Inside, there was a handwritten letter and a generous check. Helena hugged him tightly and whispered, "You are living proof that God is never late. He just waits for the right time to make you fly." Back to his routine, Gabriel continued his career, but now his purpose was greater than any job. He began giving talks in schools and churches, sharing his story as a testimony. Young people listened, enchanted, the elderly wept, and many rediscovered their lost faith. "No matter how big your fall," he would say, "God always has an alternative flight plan." This phrase became the motto of a social project he created, Wings of Hope, a foundation dedicated to offering free technical training courses to underprivileged young people who dream of working in aviation. The foundation grew rapidly. Gabriel invested a good portion of his salary and donated all the prize money he received. In a short time, dozens of young people were studying thanks to him. "You will not only learn to fly airplanes," he would say at the inaugurations, "you will learn to trust the one who controls the sky." Many of those students years later became pilots, mechanics, and engineers, and all carried the same symbol, two small wings, and the phrase engraved on them, "When life gets out of control, God takes the helm." One day, at a ceremony held by the airline itself, Gabriel received a surprise tribute. They christened a new plane with his name. Faith wings upon, seeing the inscription painted beside the cockpit, he was moved. He touched the letters, took a deep breath and said, "May every flight carry a little of this faith throughout the world." His colleagues applauded, and some wept openly. It was the most beautiful recognition he could receive, not for saving a plane, but for inspiring the world to believe that miracles still happen in mid-air. On the last flight of his career, years later, Gabriel sat at the controls for the last time. The sunset painted the horizon in golden hues, and the clouds looked like mountains of cotton. The co-pilot, a recent graduate, looked at him with admiration and asked, "Captain, what's the secret to flying so well?" Gabriel smiled and replied, "The secret is simple. Never forget who holds up the sky." The young man laughed, but his gaze said he understood. When the plane landed, the entire airport awaited him. Employees, family, friends, and even passengers from that miraculous flight were there. Applause echoed, cameras recorded, and he descended from the cockpit with slow, firm steps. He received a golden plaque with the title, "Gabriel Nogueira, the man who flew by faith." He smiled and, as always, looked up. That night, at home, he opened the old notebook he'd kept since his student days. The yellowed pages still contained altitude calculations, route drawings, and inspirational quotes. With a blue pen, he wrote his last note, "The sky is not the limit. The sky is a reminder that God is in control." She closed her notebook, looked at the starry sky through the window and whispered, "Mission accomplished, Father." And so ended the most important flight of his life, not the one that crossed continents, but the one that touched the hearts of millions. Gabriel Nogueira didn't just save a plane. He taught the whole world that faith is the fuel that keeps human wings in motion, even when everything seems to be falling apart. Time, that old pilot of destiny, continued flying, and Gabriel Nogueira followed his route, now guided by something that radar could never capture: faith. He no longer lived to prove anything to the world, nor to be remembered as a hero. He lived to serve, to inspire, to teach that true flight begins when the soul understands that it no longer needs to fight the storms alone. And in each landing, in each grateful look, in each silent embrace of those who recognized him, he saw the confirmation that the miracle of that day in the sky would never be forgotten. The headlines became memories, but the impact of his gesture remained etched as an eternal echo in humanity. Pilots used his words in training, teachers told his story in classrooms, and pastors quoted his testimony in sermons about faith and purpose. And while the world applauded him, Gabriel remained the same man as before, the one who preferred to sit on the sidewalk and talk to God looking at the sky, rather than occupy stages full of lights. One night, many years later, he decided to revisit the airport where it had all happened. He was retired, but his heart still beat to the rhythm of the engines. He walked slowly through the silent, now remodeled and modern terminal, and stopped in front of a display case where a miniature replica of the plane he had saved was on display. The plaque read, "Flight 421, the miracle in the skies, under the command of Gabriel Nogueira, He stood there for long minutes, his gaze distant, remembering every second, every prayer, every tear that mingled with the turmoil of that day. Suddenly, a child approached. About 7 years old, with blonde hair and curious eyes. The child looked at the sign and then at him. "Young man, was this your plane?" Gabriel smiled tenderly. "It was God's small plane. I only held the controls for a while." The boy laughed without fully understanding, but that answer remained etched in his heart. When his mother called him and took him away, Gabriel looked up and whispered, "And that is how the Lord plants new wings in the generations that are yet to fly." In the following days, he began writing letters. They weren't for newspapers or companies. They were letters to himself, to God, and to the people who had marked his life. He wrote to Donna Helena, thanking her again for being the instrument of his new beginning. He wrote to the pilot who fainted on that flight and who, years later, recovered, visited him in tears. And he also wrote a letter to all those who had lost their faith. If life took you down from heaven, it wasn't punishment. It was a pause. God only interrupts the flight of those he still wants to teach to land in the right place. These letters were collected by friends and turned into a book called Between Clouds and Miracles, which became a worldwide bestseller. But what moved Gabriel the most was knowing that every penny raised was donated to the social project, Wings of Hope, which continued to train young pilots, mechanics, and engineers. In one of the classes, a shy boy raised his hand and said, "Mr. Nogueira, I came here because I heard your story. I also lived on the streets, and now I want to learn to fly." Gabriel hugged him with tears in his eyes and replied, "Then, my son, heaven is waiting for you." One morning, he received an unexpected visit at home. It was an international film crew. They wanted to make a documentary about his life, showing how a simple man had become a global symbol of faith. He agreed, but on one condition. "I don't want the film to be about me. I want it to be about what God has done through me." The documentary was released months later and won awards in several countries. The title, The Man Who Spoke to Heaven. But away from the spotlight, Gabriel truly enjoyed the silence. Sometimes he would wake up before sunrise, make coffee, and sit on the balcony, watching the stars disappear on the horizon. In those moments, he would talk to God like an old friend. "Father, you let me fall to teach me how to fly again. I understand. Life is the airplane, and faith is the fuel. Whoever trusts in you never falls. They only change altitude." One day, he received a letter from the Vatican. The Pope had read his book and wanted to thank him personally for his contribution to faith and humanity. The message read, "The Lord showed the world that miracles happen when man surrenders the reins of his life to God." Gabriel wept silently, without pride, only gratitude. He knew that the true miracle was not landing a plane, but transforming hearts. Time passed a little more, and his body no longer had the same vigor, but his voice remained firm, serene, full of wisdom. One day, during a lecture, he was asked, "Mr. Nogueira, what have you learned from all this?" He looked at the audience, smiled, and replied, "I learned that faith doesn't free us from turbulence. It teaches us how to get through it without losing our way." People gave them a standing ovation, and that phrase echoed for years, repeated in temples, schools, and even airplane cabins. Sometime later, Gabriel bid farewell to the skies. Now retired, he moved to a small house in the countryside, surrounded by trees and the sound of birds. The smell of coffee in the morning reminded him of Donna Helena, and the wind rustling through the windows brought back memories of the heights. He still kept his old notebook, now carefully stored in a drawer, and it was in it that he wrote his last words, in shaky handwriting but full of life. "If one day you lose control, close your eyes and trust. The pilot doesn't sleep. He's in command, even when the sky darkens. That night, the sky seemed more beautiful than usual. The stars shone with unusual intensity, and a light breeze swept across the field. Gabriel looked up and felt an indescribable peace. A slight smile formed on his lips. He whispered the same phrase he had said on the day of the miracle. "The sign has arrived, Father, and I understand." Days later, the world received news of his passing, but there was no sadness. There was gratitude. Entire cities paid tribute. Planes flew in formation, making the sign of the cross in the sky, and social media was filled with messages. Pilots in several countries observed a minute of silence before takeoff. And at the airline's headquarters, they placed a golden plaque with his words immortalized: "When life gets out of control, God takes the helm." The Project Wings of Hope, he remained active, and hundreds of young people followed in his footsteps. In the main courtyard of the foundation, erected in his memory, there is a simple statue of Gabriel looking at the sky, with one hand over his heart and the other pointing upwards. Engraved on its base is a phrase that has become the summary of his life. It's not about flying high, it's about flying with faith. And so, Gabriel Nogueira, the man who one day asked for a sign, became the sign himself. His story transformed into an eternal legacy, reminding humanity that faith is not the wind that pushes the wings, but the sky that sustains them. Because in the end, every flight ends in a landing. But only those who trust in God. And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone you love. Click now to share it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories we're preparing with great care for you. Remember, every like, every subscription, and every comment helps us reach more people and keep alive this mission of touching hearts through stories. So be part of this family that grows every day, and never forget, you are also the protagonist of your own story. He discovers that some landings are not the end, they are the beginning of eternity.